Hi, Dinesh. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast.
It's lovely to be here, Claudia.
So, you mentioned there that we often don't tend to think of animals as victims of violence. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so if we think about this from the history of social movements, many social movements, as part of their, let's call it politics of recognition, have sought recognition for forms of systematic violence that they experience that society does not treat as violence. So, to give you one example, lots of work of feminists is aimed at highlighting the systematic ways that women experience violence in a society that often validates or ignores or treats that violence as benign, natural, as to be accepted. So, lots of the work of feminist theory is precisely saying, no, this form of treatment is actually violence. In the area that I do some research work on, which is around disability rights, there are similar problems in that space where many forms of institutional treatment of people with disability is explained away by legal regimes or social convention as care, as justifiable treatment. But again, if we're frank about it, and disability movements are typically frank about this, these are actually forms of violence. What we notice here is that one of the strategies of violence is to treat the object of violence as an object who cannot be violated. So this almost is one of the ruses of violence, the way that violence works, is to construct the object of violence as a subject who cannot experience violence and therefore erase the fact of this violence as a strategy. And I would argue we see this particular strategy of violence across different fields. In the space of
Mhm.
animals, of course, this is standard. I think it's routinely standard that the law, social institutions, social conventions, and cultures will imagine that animals do not or cannot experience violence. And even at its worst, will visibly see animals experiencing violence, but register this as something else, as not violence.
Mhm.
It is for this reason that I think epistemology is important to consider. So, in The War Against Animals, I describe three different ways to think about violence. One example of violence I would call individual or intersubjective. So, if one individual punches another, this would be an example of an intersubjective form of violence. So, an act of violence against another person that might reflect harm or might reflect an act of a non-consensual act. A different form of violence would be something that would be structural or institutional. So, where a set of institutions collaborate to reproduce violence, whether it's physical, mental, psychological, whatever it is. Here, the individual is less in the focus, but institutions, practices are collectivized and systematically work against an individual or groups of individuals.
Mhm.
But the third level of violence I describe in the book, which I think is very important when we think about animals, is epistemic. So when I refer to epistemic, I'm talking about our knowledge systems. Our knowledge systems allow us to look at the world in particular ways and to see individuals as either full rights bearing individuals or some sort of entity that lacks those rights and dignity. We know that a kind of hierarchical anthropocentrism dominates our society, where
Mhm.
most animals are treated as beings who are not granted full recognition. And of course, this means that these individuals can be subject to forms of violence, and we don't see them as experiencing violence or as subjects of violence. Here again, we see this trick of violence or the strategy of violence, which is often, as I said, to systematically construct the object of violence as somebody who cannot be violated. And I think we see this directly in play in lots of different spheres of our treatment of animals. So one extreme example is something I talk about in the book is the the pictures you see in butcher shops. So some of the most horrific ones are a smiling cow with a knife in their hand cutting their own body.
What?
And this to me illustrates a kind of the full extent of the epistemic erasure of the reality of the animal as a subject of violence. In this case, the animal is actively participating and enjoying violence against themselves. And I think, I mean, I've taken an extreme example, but we actually see lots of different examples of this. So, animal agriculture producers, while subjecting billions of animals to what I would describe as a living hell, will actively say that these animals are cared for, that they even maybe want this form of treatment, that we cannot imagine a better form of life than what we give these animals. And that to me is an example of this epistemic erasure. That erasure, of course, removes from sight the fact that we actually have billions of targets of violence, or billions, maybe billions of victims of violence that have been placed in those facilities through human interests. And to me, that stepping away from the epistemic violence is actually one of the hardest things to do because it's deeply ingrained in our cultures and ways of looking. But when we do so, of course, we start to get closer to the truth of the relations of power before us, and they're confronting, right? And that's partly why I called the book The War Against Animals. It is intended to highlight what I think is a confronting reality that we have in our midst.